Now that we've looked at the three economic questions and the different economic systems, let's look a little bit at the United States and how we handle our mixed yet leaning free market system. In the United States, basically we have kind of always been on the side of free markets, which is characterized by individual or corporate ownership of capital goods. Investments in firms are usually made in a free market by private decision, so people can buy stocks, they can invest in different ways. But we always wrestle with this issue of how much freedom, and this is where the government's going to get involved, whether that's federal, state, or local governments. They place limits on us. There are laws we have to follow, and you can see some of them here. Now, basic characteristics, we believe in the idea of everyone has an opportunity, the idea of incentives, whether we do that, sometimes the government will do that with a tax code, give tax credits for certain behaviors. Sometimes we place excise taxes on certain goods because we're trying to curb some of those behaviors. We believe in the idea of profit motive, both as a consumer to get more of our needs and wants met, and also as producers to sell our goods for profits. Competition, open opportunity, the idea that anyone can compete. Legal equality, the idea that everyone has the same legal rights, both as consumers and producers. Of course, we put age restrictions in certain things. For instance, you have to be a certain age to get a credit card or that kind of thing. But, legal equality is there. And then the property rights is a big thing. The government doesn't own the properties, or the means of production. So things like the Fifth Amendment, which a lot of people know for pleading the Fifth in court, but there's actually elements to the Fifth Amendment that you need to know about protecting individuals from having property seized by the federal government. They have to be provided just compensation. So the government could take your land for public use through a process called eminent domain, but they have to provide what's called just compensation. Now, we had to pass the 14th Amendment, and in there's some property protections as well, but this would protect against the state governments from doing the same thing, because the Fifth Amendment didn't necessarily close that loophole as it pertained to property. Now, we believe in economic freedom, the idea that you can enter into contracts freely, voluntary exchange. You can go into a store and you don't have to buy anything. You could actually just walk back out. So these are all different characteristics we focus on. Some of the key roles: the role of the consumer, the role of the firm, and specifically the entrepreneur, the person who starts the business, and then the role of the government. So the role of the consumer, basically you can make your own choices as a consumer. You can join interest groups to try to get your particular view on something known to the government for passing of laws. You can send signals through voluntary exchange when everyone's kind of buying the same type of clothing, that's in style. It sends a signal on how much to make or to keep making it. When those clothes aren't being bought and they're just kind of sitting on the rack at the store, that sends a signal too that we're not really interested in it. Don't waste the resources to make something like this. Change it up. And then producers will go back to that, those three questions. What should we produce? And they'll change their mind and use the resources another way. The entrepreneur has to decide how to combine those scarce resources to produce, hopefully, what the customer wants, and to create new goods and services, to keep up with changing ideas and wants and needs. And they have to go through the whole process of starting businesses. Now, government kind of takes over the rest of this, and they have a limited role compared to other nations. But they do have a primary role, and those are constitutionally driven, to protect property rights, to enforce contracts and other business activities, and to make sure that everything in the marketplace is being conducted fairly according to the law. Now, over time, Americans have come to expect the government to take other actions, starting especially during the Great Depression. We started seeing government do what's called Keynesian economics and more government spending to help the economy. And so this brought in a number of new things and regulatory bodies to promote the public interest or the concerns of society as a whole. And so The government's main role is to promote information. So if you think about public disclosure laws, they're the ones saying you have to provide what the ingredients are in the food we eat, so that people can be safe and know what's in it in case they have allergies or other health issues. They're going to promote free enterprise and customers knowing what certain products are, and producers being able to know more about their customers. And so basically protecting the public health, safety, and well-being. That's where all your regulations are going to be for. Now, there are negative effects. I mean, the positives are we're more safe, and better off in general when we have these kinds of things. But there is a negative side to it. Deregulation can help businesses, but too much deregulation can give too much power to businesses over the consumers. And so they're always trying to balance a lot of this stuff. So some of the agencies that are in the federal government, you can look down here and kind of see what they regulate. And again, all these are for great reasons, but then the big debate comes is, do they reach too far? And this is going back to those goals of societies of what about freedom? When you let government do certain things, you do give up a certain amount of freedom. And so in America, we tend to have elections and debate how much freedom should certain agencies have, how restrictive should we be with certain laws, and usually we're wanting the same thing, but many sides of any argument are going to look at these agencies a little differently. Okay. Now, the government does try to support and encourage economic growth because that leads to higher standard of living and more of our needs being met as a society. So three main things they look at. They're going to want maximum employment, as many people working as possible. We call full employment anything between 4% unemployment and 6% unemployment. Usually you'll never get down to zero because of structural unemployment that we'll talk about in a future unit. But if you're 4 to 6%, we're basically arguing that there's no cyclical unemployment, meaning unemployment caused by a downturn in the business cycle of the economy. And so that's one factor. A growing economy is important. Government may adjust things to either lower taxes. They may increase government spending when it calls for it, and there's different things that the government's going to do to interject and add to the burden when we can maybe afford it, or take away from the burden when we can't. And again, different philosophies kind of inform when some of that should happen. Stability, we want price stability. We don't want prices popping up and down. We don't want inflation. And so a lot of times the government's stepping in to try to create that stability. To accomplish this, it requires economic citizenship, or the involvement of its citizens. And since we say that the three main questions are being answered by individuals primarily, meaning businesses and consumers, it does require our involvement. And so our economic strength comes through our productivity, our innovation, and the government might help with things like research and development. And so you can see some of the acts that have helped that, or things like NASA research, patents, and copyrights that are issued and protected by the government. And just encouraging the idea of this American work ethic, the idea that you have to work for what you have. Okay? And so they'll measure things like the gross domestic product, GDP, which we'll talk about a little bit. When we think about all these things, though, for standard of living, we're not counting things like education, poverty rates, income inequality, and health measures, but those are issues we will look at through our government to try to provide some of that equality that we mentioned. Although, remember, our version of equality is not the same thing that someone in a command economy might look to. Now, when you hear the word public versus private in economics, public means something that is coming from the government. And in our case, public means it's paid for by the taxpayers, going through the government and those agencies to provide a good or a service that might be something that would be inefficient or impractical for consumers to pay for it individually, or it would just be hard to exclude people who didn't pay for it. The government builds our roads mainly because they're very expensive, But if everyone had to privately build their own roads to travel everywhere, we'd have roads everywhere. We'd eat up our land. And just the fact that it's not really feasible for everyone to pay for roads everywhere they drive, it gets real expensive. Look at what a 1 mile section of road costs to put in, or just to expand where you live. And you'll see it's usually in the millions of dollars. So that would be impractical. And then the other thing is, if you built a road, how would you keep everyone from using it? You can't really police it and monitor your own road for 24/7 to keep, non-payers off of it. So we turn that over to the government and say, hey, take a little bit of our tax dollars, build it for us, we'll all use it, and the government regulates who can be on it and who can't through our police force, through our driving laws, who gets licenses, for instance. So we call that the public sector, where government's involved in the transactions and the production. Okay, when we say private sector, like I meant businesses and individuals having transactions and producing things, but it's without the government involvement. So if you go into a store and buy something, that's a private transaction in the private sector. Okay, now, just like we have to when we make decisions, the government will have to weigh cost and benefits, and so the benefits always must outweigh the cost for the government to do something, to build infrastructure, for instance. Okay, it's got to help the public as a whole. Not everybody obviously will benefit, but this is where they look more to the majority. We want to talk about this idea of a free rider problem. When you have public goods, you will have people who are not willing to pay for a certain good or service, but if it gets built or made, they're going to benefit from it anyway. Okay, and we call this an example of market failure. That does not mean the market failed. What it means is that we are not distributing resources equally. Okay, if they build a bridge in Alaska, that's part of the United States, and they use United States tax dollars. But unless you go to Alaska, you're not really going to get the use of that, and so that resource is not distributed equally for all Americans, even though collectively our tax dollars are paying for it. But they try to, do this all over the place, and so there's always going to be some form of failure or, inequality in terms of resource distribution. So how are public goods created? Study this chart because it kind of goes through it. So let's take a hypothetical situation where farmers in Cap County are driving an extra 100 miles to get their crops across the river. So they say, hey, we want to build a bridge. So they weigh out the benefits and the cost. They do a cost-benefit analysis. They're thinking at the margin. And the farmers say, well, if we could come up with $20,000 each, if the 100 farmers built the bridge, they could save $20,000 each. Okay. Now, if the bridge is built, though, 1 million other residents would all save $20 each. Okay. So there's a possibility of savings here of $22 million. Now, in the free market, the farmers would have to build the bridge themselves, but they'd all have to pony up $100,000 each, and they probably don't have that. So, as a result, market failure, the bridge is not built, the cost to the farmers exceeds the benefit. Saving $20,000 isn't worth paying $100,000. But if they could build it where everyone collectively pays $10 in the whole county, then what will happen is everyone gives up $10, but just the average citizen, look at that, they're each gaining $20. So would you pay $10 to save $20? And if you're a farmer, you're paying $10 as a citizen, but you're getting that $20,000 benefit as it relates to your business and how you get the crops across the river. So $10 each, totally worth the $22 million in savings. The bridge is built because it benefits the citizens, and that benefit exceeds the cost. So now there's going to be side effects, or what we call economic side effects are called externalities, both positive ones and negative ones. The positives, and these are things that are just side effects, meaning they weren't the reason the bridge was built. The bridge was built purely to get crops across the river without having to go 100 miles out of the way. But the positives that come from this that weren't necessarily the intention are it's going to help bring more visitors to the county. That's going to provide more jobs for construction. That's going to lead to more businesses in the local area. Restaurants are going to open. Hotels might open. Things to do. Attractions. Those would all be positives. But the negatives that come with it, you're going to have a lot of construction, increased traffic. It's going to lower the air quality, noise. River environment's altered. You're putting a bridge in there. It's changing some of the flow. It's going to harm the local fishery. And maybe you had a guy that drove a ferry to carry, individual cars or little, people right across the river there. They couldn't obviously get the crops that we're talking about, but they had a little business. But now you may have run them out because the bridge is already paid for and people are just going to use that. This is an example of negative externalities with the pollution aspect of factories, but we need the factories to produce some of the goods and services. So, you weigh those things out. And then finally, poverty. There are vast differences between people who have money, and we talked about one of the weaknesses of free markets is the idea of equity. On average, Americans have a high standard of living, yet about 15% of Americans live in poverty. And for those under the age of 18, it's even higher. So we have what's called the poverty threshold. This is the income level below which anyone below that income level that the government sets is said to be in poverty, and that's what qualifies you for welfare, which is government aid to the poor. And so we have a number of programs. They're distributing two different categories. All right, first category is cash transfers. This is where you get actual cash, so you can see Social Security if you qualify. You will get actual checks, unemployment insurance, disability. Okay, these are all cash transfers. The other category is in-kind benefits, where you get goods or services for free or at reduced rates. This might be food stamps, which aren't cash, but you exchange them for the items, and then the store can exchange those to be reimbursed. Subsidized housing or government housing, where part of the rent is paid for through tax dollars, and then the people living there would pay a smaller amount than they normally would in the marketplace for the housing. Legal aid, if you can't afford a lawyer, one might be appointed for you and paid for. So those are examples of different types of welfare, and then the question is always, how involved does the government get? Where do we set these limits? And so this is a good look at the United States as a whole in terms of how we allocate our resources and try to deal with the issue of scarcity.